This is the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. The United States promoted the idea of nuclear energy as peaceful and plentiful. But what have the consequences been, really, of this promotion? Our next guest is the author of The Wretched Atom, and he explores this through formally secret documents from the CIA and the State Department. Doug Becker explores.
I'm Doug Becker. Following the development of the atomic bomb and its use against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the Second World War, the United States was confronted with the concerns about the development of nuclear weaponry. But the technology also presumably held peaceful uses. These ranged from the development of nuclear power for electricity, as well as broad issues for medical research and other commercial uses. So the US seemingly had a dual interest in controlling which countries developed nuclear weapons. We call this nuclear nonproliferation, as well as harnessing the power of the atom for peaceful purposes. But it also fit a grand narrative and a geostrategy that the United States was implementing. In a new book, The Wretched Atom, historian Jacob Hamblin examines US policy on nuclear weapons, on nuclear technology in the years following the use of the bomb in the Second World War. We are discussing this research with the author today. Jacob Hamblin is professor of history and director of environmental arts and humanities at Oregon State University. Professor Hamblin, thank you very much for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here.
Absolutely. So in this new book, you're examining the way in which the United States framed peaceful uses of nuclear technologies against concerns, or presumably concerns, about proliferation of nuclear weapons. Can you briefly, describe what exactly was the U.S. trying to accomplish with this policy?
Sure. This whole project started when I was doing archival research at the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is in Rome. So I was researching a previous book. My last book was called Arming Mother Nature, and I was looking for information about food security for that project. And I wasn't having the best of luck with finding great information at that moment. But I ran across these files by this botanist named Ronald Silo, and they were just intriguing because they were really thick files that were clearly about some kind of a controversy that had been quashed by the Food and Agriculture Organization. In the 1960s, the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Food and Agriculture Organization together had this joint division where they were promoting atomic energy solutions in the developing world. And this particular botanist was kind of outraged by this, thought a lot of it was a scam, and accused a lot of his superiors of corruption and incompetence. And none of this ever got out. But here it all was in these files. And it's a kind of an interesting story, and I do talk about it in the book. And even if you don't come away from that story feeling like he was right or he was wrong, what was clear to me at the end of that was that there were a lot of people who wanted a success story in atomic energy, in peaceful atomic energy. People at the international level, people in the US government, lots of other governments around the world really wanting these success stories. And so for me, I wanted to explore that story to try to see, okay, instead of thinking about the peaceful atom as this kind of idealistic, happy-go-lucky alternative to the warlike atom, which is what we typically see, I wanted to look at it as its own story of geopolitics, its own story of manipulation, its own story of propaganda, and to really kind of focus on that. So, looking at that time period right after World War II to really, it's actually the whole second half of the 20th century, it was just a fascinating time for the United States, doing a lot of promising for these technologies, not always delivering on them, not even necessarily needing to deliver on them. But it just seemed like it was a ripe time. And this is a time of decolonization around the world where a lot of countries were gaining their independence. It's for the first time in history, you see a massive shifting away from the US and Europe of a major natural energy resource, namely oil. So trying to figure out how the US kind of maneuvered in that kind of environment, I found it to be totally intriguing. And I felt like the atomic energy, peaceful atomic energy in particular, was an I don't want to say underappreciated, but definitely less understood element of that kind of maneuvering.
Yeah, peaceful energy uses, building nuclear power plants certainly is a huge part of this. One of the things that I was really fascinated with your research were the different types of technologies, the different types of promises on nuclear technology. It seems like it was more than just electricity generation that the United States, was promising, was exploring. Could you talk about some of those?
Yeah, when these promises, as I'm describing them, really began to be made by the U.S. government as propaganda. I mean, today we think about nuclear power, electricity generation as being the main technology. But even then, in let's say 1953, when President Dwight Eisenhower made a very famous speech called that we now call the Atoms for Peace speech, promising to share this technology with the world. Even then, nobody had built reactors for electricity generation, including the United States. Nobody had done it yet. So even then, it was kind of aspirational. But at that time, the kinds of technologies that the US really had in mind to promote around the world was not electricity generation. It was, things like things that most people haven't even heard of today, like mutation plant breeding or disinfestation of grain using radiation, or sterilizing insects to control disease, food preservation with irradiation, all kinds of potential things that you can promote. And in fact, one of the reasons why this was so helpful or useful for the U.S. to promote is because in the late 1940s, early 1950s in particular, the U.S. didn't have a lot of uranium. And so the U.S. government, as a matter of policy, did not promote atomic energy, peaceful atomic energy, if it had to do with nuclear reactors, because they didn't want anybody to compete with the uranium for the weapons arsenal. So things that were kind of byproducts, essentially radioactive waste, like radioisotopes that are made through the fission process, those were something that the U.S. government promoted and said, hey, maybe you can use these. You can use these in a variety of different ways. And they were cheap, and they could be sent to European partners, certainly, but one of the big benefits was sending them to other countries around the world, including countries of what were known at that time, countries of the developing world. The other technologies I didn't even mention was, pairing nuclear reactors later, pairing them with desalination plants, trying to desalt seawater to, make deserts bloom. There are all kinds of things that could be done. At a certain point in time, detonating explosives, nuclear explosive, essentially bombs, those were promoted by the U.S. as something that could be used for building harbors, making massive geophysical changes.
Yeah, one of the themes, particularly in the early part of the book, was how fascinated the U.S. was and how they, promoted this fascination with just this new technology. We had this image now that the U.S. had seen the destruction, the world had seen the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we're outraged by it. But that's not the theme that I'm getting, from your writing, that it was much more that there was a kind of fascination that this really is the technology of the future.
Well, there certainly were some people who believed it was the technology of the future, and I do not mean to suggest that all this was fake, but from the U.S. government's perspective, I can't emphasize enough, and I think I do emphasize it in the book, that none of it really had to be real, because one of the reasons why the peaceful atom was such a formidable tool of state power in the 50s, 60s, 70s was because it leveraged people's aspirations. It leveraged, developing countries' aspirations to modernize and to bring the status of living, the quality of life to the point of Europeans and Americans. But what's key about that is that nuclear technologies have never had to come through on those promises. When you're promising something about the future, all you really have to do is to sell the promise. So yeah, there were certainly some who believed in that, but for the most part, this was conceived of as a kind of propaganda. I mean, this is not just true of Eisenhower's famous speech in 1953, late 1953, but it was true of his predecessor, Harry Truman. I mean, if you think about kind of just key moments in promises of the peaceful atom, you think of 1946, where you have there's this proposal that the Truman administration made about sharing atomic energy at the international level. Well, that was right at the time when the U.S. was starting to do post-war atmospheric tests of atomic bombs. And you need something to kind of counteract the ramping up of the weapons arsenal. It happened again when the United States decided to build to start the program to build the hydrogen bomb. It happened again. You had a lot of propaganda about sharing with the world, and of course, in 1953, when President Eisenhower did it, famously, this was very much a strategy to counteract what he knew was coming, which was a major series in 1954 of hydrogen bomb tests in the South Pacific. So, they're conceived of as propaganda, and when you look at the archival documents, it's very clear that most of the government officials and many of the scientists, I should say, as well, really had no idea what specific technologies they had in mind. It was a promise. And so there really was this battery of promises that were made, which is one of the reasons why by the time you get to the 1960s, you have so many people in the US government and also international agencies really just craving any kind of success story in all these domains. There's this sort of joke that these organizations were hammers in search of nails. They didn't matter what your problem was, as long as the solution was a nuclear one. They could come up with some kind of a solution for you and claim it for the peaceful atom.
Another aspect of the book I found particularly fascinating was the way in which these newly independent countries, I know two that you specifically cite are Ghana and in India, as nations that saw nuclear technology as a pathway, not just to independence, but try to break some of the dependency that they had seen, what we today would probably call concerns about neocolonialism. Is it pretty consistent then, states seeing development of nuclear technology as a pathway to independence, and then the irony of that, because I know you talk quite a bit as well about the way in which that helps to build a dependency on countries like the United States for providing this technology?
Well, there's a lot there in that question, and there's each of those cases is going to be different. But I do talk about Ghana. Ghana in the 1960s is a good example of what several countries went through, but this is a leading example of really embracing these promises. What we see, from the 60s and 70s and in the 80s and beyond is an embrace of all of the promises. And what Ghana tried to do is kind of an interesting story. So what Ghana and South Africa were doing in the 1960s were kind of competing for being the leading nuclear state in Africa. And South Africa had already won an early battle in that at the International Atomic Energy Agency. South Africa was really the representative of all Africa and Asia, despite being a white supremacist government. And so Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah, who's famous for a lot of reasons in the history of decolonization, in the nuclear realm, embraced the peaceful atom as well. And both these countries were sending people to these organizations, kind of both of them using the idea of the peaceful atom to kind of raise their profile in Africa. And it's a good example of, it's not just about the United States manipulating people. It's also the idea of the peaceful atom is useful for lots of different states for lots of different reasons. So you have some really interesting racial politics happening in Africa in the 1960s and beyond. And Ghana was certainly a country that embraced the promises of the peaceful atom. The United States was not particularly helpful with Ghana. In fact, you could say the United States helped to crush those aspirations by helping to overthrow Nkrumah. India is I would say a totally different situation. All the racial politics are definitely there as well. In the book, there are a lot of interesting tension points where you have the United States government trying to frame issues as East and West, and the United States is trying to help people modernize, whereas India, which at the time in the 1950s was trying to be a kind of a leader of the neutralist movement, is trying to embrace the language of colonialism and racism, and trying to call out countries like South Africa and the United States for racist politics at home, and doing all kinds of things the United States really didn't want them to be doing. India is a fascinating case, and I can't do justice to it here in the nuclear world, because India also embraced the peaceful atom and embraced a lot of these promises that the Americans were making. They also tried to hold on to some of their mineral wealth. There's a mineral that a lot of people haven't heard of called monazite, which early on in nuclear history, people thought, well, maybe monazites can be very important because it's needed. Monazite sand is important for thorium, and there was a time in which people thought people were going to be making thorium reactors. And the Americans were very irritated with India for holding on to, not exporting their monazite. India also very clearly did not want to join what became the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Saw it as being something that favored the global north, favored industrialized countries, saw it as, even a kind of neo-colonial organization. So, there's a lot in each individual country that we could talk about. But what's important, I guess, in all of that is, for people who might be interested in this book, the individual stories are truly fascinating in the ways that they try to engage with different countries, try to engage with these issues. But a lot of the disputes about atomic energy we imagine to be between the US and the Soviet Union. And that's definitely true. There was Cold War. There's a lot of arms race issues in this period. But most of the bitter disputes that occurred at the international level, certainly within the International Atomic Energy Agency, were not East-West. They were North-South. And they were certainly by the 1980s, the factions that kind of aligned in the IAEA were, former colonial powers, the Europeans, in other words, and the United States, and sometimes the Soviet Union, aligning themselves against what were known as the LDCs, the less developed countries. So what I would like to do with the book is to draw people's attention to that, and to look at the peaceful atom as being very much wrapped into the story of post-war decolonization politics. A lot of racial stuff, in racism stuff in this book as well.
You're listening to Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. We're discussing the campaign to promote peaceful uses of nuclear technologies, of nuclear power, and a new book entitled The Wretched Atom, with its author, Jacob Hamblin. So, with respect to the IAEA, that was something as an international relations scholar I found particularly fascinating, because we usually present the IAEA, this is an international agency that the US helped to create ostensibly, so it's not the US necessarily directing policies on nuclear power, nuclear proliferation, but it has a certain international legitimacy. But the narrative you tell about the US and the US's allies and its control of the IAEA kind of really pokes some holes in the notion of this independent agency. Could you talk a bit about the role the IAEA has played?
Sure. Yeah. Most of what we understand about that agency's origins is complete baloney. It's just not the case. And this was an organization that today, if you read the news, that they're often called the UN's nuclear watchdog, and we have this conception that they were created specifically to police and to make sure that people weren't developing nuclear weapons. That is not the case at all. That is not why it was created. Over the years, part of the story of the book is to show that the kind of evolution of a lot of these organizations, and certainly the IAEA is one, into this kind of global surveillance policing organization. Remember that when this organization was created, IAEA, in 1957, really as very much a direct consequence of that Atoms for Peace speech, there was no such thing as a nuclear proliferation treaty. This is something that happened more than a decade afterwards. So there's a long period of time where the people who were in the IAEA, they were promoting atomic energy. They were looking for nuclear, success stories, but they also didn't have much of a mandate beyond that. And the idea of using the IAEA as a way of kind of policing a non-proliferation treaty didn't sit well with everybody. I mean, it's the NPT, which exists today. It's got, I don't know, either around 200 countries that are members of it, or less, maybe more or less. I haven't looked at the latest numbers. I mean, there are a lot of people who are part of this organization, the NPT I'm talking about, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But some of the people who always said, no, we're not going to join this NPT, like India, said, why would we join this? This is something that is trying to keep these technologies out of the hands of other states and keep them in the hands of those who already have them. And oh, by the way, India and others, it's not all people in India who are making this claim, but oh, by the way, the only reason that this non-proliferation treaty was ever negotiated was after the so-called colored bombs started appearing, right? China detonated a nuclear bomb in 1964, and that is what really got the ball rolling on the United States and the Soviet Union and Europeans saying we need to make sure nobody else gets this bomb. It wasn't after France got it. It wasn't. Those are also part of the racial dimensions of the global non-proliferation regime. And after India detonated theirs in 1974, what they called a peaceful nuclear explosion, a lot of people said that this was a great betrayal of the idea of the peaceful atom, even though the United States had been promoting detonations for a long time, and in any event, it's an interesting moment in 1974 when India did that really strengthened the resolve of Westerners, the Northerners, like the United States and Europeans, to really clamp down on the nuclear trade in ways that they certainly never had in the past. And it has ramifications for other countries too. I mean, a lot of the promises that were made to places like Iran, for example, things got a lot harder after India detonated their so-called peaceful nuclear explosion.
Another one of the themes about this development of nuclear technology and nuclear power that you'll cite is the way in which issues about development of these resources reframe the question of why we develop new technologies to focus on sort of human need or economic need as opposed to issues of environmental degradation. Even peaceful use, as we tend to think the greatest concern is development of weaponry, but any of us who've studied environmental issues know issues, for instance, like waste developed from nuclear power plants is easily as much of an environmental threat. So how much is this really about shifting norms to say, we'll deal with the environment later, if at all?
There's a little bit of schizophrenia about environmental issues among in the atomic industry, and again, there are a lot of people who are interested in atomic energy, nuclear energy today, that are sincere in their concerns about the world. So I'm not trying to paint with a hugely broad brush. This book isn't so much about industry as it is about governments. And so what's kind of interesting when you think about what atomic energy is in the hands of a government, certainly the United States government over many years, this is a bipartisan thing. So it's, Democrat, Republican, they all did it. But it's also in other countries. In the hands of governments, atomic energy typically has thrived in a cornucopian narrative. This is something that is not my invention. I talk about this idea of cornucopian a lot in the book, but it's something that has been used over the years. It just refers to the fabled horn of plenty from ancient Greek mythology, right? Where it's a promise of peace and plenty. So you need to make sure that atomic energy promises something, promises development, promises economic advancement, promises modernization, promises food. It can be really basic, promises access to water, more foods, more variety of foods, something that is going to be positive, or curing cancer, medicine, climate change. We're gonna solve climate change. All these kinds of arguments are very standard fare for atomic energy and have been for over 7 decades, right? So that's a cornucopian message, but it also involves environmental things, right? I mean, I just mentioned climate change. So you would think that would make it very pro-environment. You can say, hey, you can, instead of spraying pesticides, Rachel Carson in the early 1960s warned us not to indiscriminately spray pesticides. Instead, we can irradiate insects and cure diseases that way. We won't need it. It's a biological control. Those kinds of arguments have been made a lot with atomic energy. So in one respect, they're very much alive to the arguments of environmental things. On the other hand, you also have a little bit of tone deafness if there are toward other kinds of concerns. If there are concerns that are critical of nuclear power. Concerns about radioactive waste, concerns about nuclear accidents, concerns about long-term health effects to exposure to radiation, whether it's occupational exposure or living near a nuclear power plant. Those kinds of things tended to get way played down, not just by the people in the industry, but also by governments. And so you have these two narratives, these are two very much in contradiction narratives in play. And one of the things that I do talk about in this book is that cornucopian message and how important it is, not just for environmental issues, which are very important, obviously, but how much that cornucopian message is baked into international affairs right now because of the need for different governments, including the United States, to try to control the nuclear trade, whether it's for weapons or whatever. You have got to make sure, if you were the United States, you've got to make sure that the IAEA seems like a legitimate organization. Otherwise, the entire nuclear non-proliferation regime falls apart. So of course you're going to say, yes, we're going to cure cancer. Yes, we're going to solve all your environmental problems. Yes, nuclear power is the way, it's the future. It's the way, the truth and the light, so to speak. You have to have this promise of the future for any of the other stuff to be legitimate at all, which makes that promise kind of problematic, right? Some people are going to look at this book and say, oh, he's an anti-nuclear guy. And it's not really meant to be an anti-nuclear screed. It's you open the newspaper in any given week, right? And there'll be something about, maybe nuclear power is the solution to climate change. Well, that argument comes from somewhere. And there will definitely be certainly industry boosters who will say that. And many are doing it because they really believe it. Again, I'm not trying to say that these people are dishonest. But when that is the position of governments, you have got to recognize that there are reasons governments must take this position. And historically have done so, as I said, for decades. It's not a new argument at all, and it certainly is not specific to climate change.
That's a wonderful point to stop the conversation and encourage everyone listening to pick up this book. This is a wonderful historical narrative placing a number of these questions into its historical context. I think of that last point about the way in which a number of advocates for nuclear power are saying nuclear power doesn't release carbon dioxide. So therefore, our concerns for climate change, we need to include nuclear power to try to replace some of our current energy infrastructure. And also, I think the context of wonderful chapter at the end where you talk about the way in which advocates wrestled with Chernobyl. And I was thinking with that the same thing happening with Fukushima, and to try to recover nuclear power and nuclear technology and say it's really not that dangerous. The title of the book is The Wretched Atom. The author is Jacob Darwin Hamblin. He has been our guest. He is professor of history and director of environmental arts and humanities at Oregon State University. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you to our guest and to you for listening. The Scholars Circle team includes Doug Becker, host, Ankine Arassian and Melissa Chiprin, managing producers, Sad Dongre, our webmaster. I'm Maria Armoudian, and we'll see you next week.